They picked him up under the arms, carried him to the head of his company, and set him down on the ground where his men could see him. That was what he had asked them to do. He was a captain. He had been shot on a low hill in southern Spain, and the wound was going to kill him. Then he told them to keep fighting. 3 weeks later, on the 6th of June, 1811, a short account of him ran in the Times of London. It described what he had done. It said he had been so severely wounded that he ought to have quitted the field. It did not have his name. It would take 67 years for a regimental historian to write that name down. By then, the words the captain was remembered for had been given to another man entirely, and the phrase built out of them had entered the English language for good. The village of Albuera sits on a plain in Extremadura, in the southwest of Spain. In May of 1811, it was in the way of something. The British were besieging the fortress of Badajoz. Marshal Soult was marching to relieve it with 24,000 men. Standing between them was a patched-together Allied army under William Carr Beresford, British regiments, Portuguese regiments, and a Spanish corps that had arrived in the dark the night before and spent the small hours being shuffled into position. Around 35,000 men in total, speaking 3 languages, most of whom had never fought alongside each other. Soult was a professional. On the morning of the 16th, he made a show of attacking the village itself, and while the Allies watched the village, he took the bulk of his army on a march through the olive woods to the south and came up hard against the Allied right, where almost nobody was looking. What was there was a single Spanish division under José de Zayas. Zayas had 1 division. Coming at him were 2. He held anyway, not for a heroic minute, but for the better part of an hour, alone, on the high ground, while British brigades were turned around and pushed across the field to reach him. By mid-morning, the fighting had concentrated onto a stretch of rising ground, perhaps a kilometer wide. Nearly everything that happened for the rest of the day happened there. Sir John Colborne's brigade was one of the units sent to relieve the Spanish. 4 battalions, a little over 2,000 men, moving up onto open ground in line. Then the weather arrived. It came down as hail and rain, hard enough to soak through the cartridge boxes and wet the priming, and thick enough to close the visibility down to almost nothing. A musket with wet powder is a stick with a bayonet on it. 2,000 men found this out at the same moment. Out of the rain came the Lancers. They were Poles, the Vistula Legion, riding with French hussars, and they came in from the flank, out of the weather, at men who could not see them coming and could not shoot them when they did. What followed was not a fight. 3 of Colborne's 4 battalions were effectively destroyed in the time it takes to cross a field at a canter. The 4th, the 2nd of the 31st, got into square before the Lancers reached them and came off comparatively intact. The other 3 did not get those seconds. The brigade had gone in with 2,166 men. It lost 1,413 of them. The worst of it fell on the 1st Battalion of the 3rd Foot, the Buffs. 755 men went up that slope. Around 112 walked off it. Among the Buffs that morning was a lieutenant named Matthew Latham. The regiment carried 2 flags, the King's color and the regimental color. These were not decoration. On a field full of smoke, where a shouted order carried perhaps 30 yards, the colors were how a battalion knew where it was, and losing one to the enemy was the specific, permanent humiliation every regiment in Europe organized itself to avoid. Carrying them was the ensign's duty, and it was the most dangerous duty a young officer could draw. The job required a man to stand in the open holding a large, bright object exactly where every soldier in the battalion could see it, which is the same place every soldier on the other side could see it. Latham was not carrying either flag that morning. He was a lieutenant in a line of men doing what the rest of them were doing, and the flags were somebody else's problem. Nothing about the next few seconds was going to be asked of him. The ensign holding the king's color went down. Latham had one obvious course of action, which was to keep doing his job and let the flag lie where it fell. That was survivable. It was also what almost everyone else on that slope was doing. He took it. A French dragoon rode at him and cut down at his head. The blow took off his nose and laid open the side of his face. Latham kept hold of the flag. A second blow took his left arm off at the shoulder. He still did not let go. What he did instead was work the color free of its staff with the hand he had left, push the silk down inside the front of his jacket, and fall on top of it. The cavalry went over him and left him for dead among a great many men who were. He was not dead. Sometime later he got himself as far as a stream and was found there. Latham lived. Surgeons rebuilt what they could of his face, and the Prince of Wales is said to have paid for the work. He stayed in the army, made captain in 1813, and afterwards did something that reads strangely for a man cut apart by French cavalry. He retired to France, married a French woman, and lived out a long life there. He is buried at Blingell, under a stone his brother officers paid for. The color came off the field inside his coat. Behind Colborne came Houghton's brigade, and in Houghton's brigade was the 57th Regiment of Foot, the West Middlesex, commanded by a lieutenant colonel named William Inglis. They walked into the same ground, not into the Lancers who had done their work and gone, but into massed French infantry firing at a range where neither side could reasonably miss, on a slope already covered with the results of the last hour. Inglis was hit by a grape shot in the neck, a 4-ounce iron ball at close range into the throat of a man on foot. He stayed on the field. He carried the shot inside his body for 2 days before a surgeon took it out. The 57th did not move and did not break. Well over 400 of them were hit, out of somewhere between 570 and 650 engaged. The sources disagree on the denominator, and no version of the arithmetic is kind. 23 of its officers went down. The French assault stalled. Late in the day, the British Fusilier Brigade came up the same slope into the same fire. 2,000 men who lost half their number taking it, and broke the French column at the top. Soult pulled back east. Beresford held the field, which is the technical definition of winning, and had lost close to 6,000 men doing it. The next morning they walked the ground to count. What they found on the crest was the 57th, still in the shape of a regiment. The dead were lying in their ranks, in order, where the line had been, and every wound was in the front of the body. Beresford put it in his official dispatch in those words: "Our dead, particularly the 57th Regiment, were lying as they fought, in the ranks, every wound in front. Not one man in that regiment had turned around." Within a year, the nickname existed. A lieutenant of the Royal Horse Artillery named William Swaby wrote in his diary on the first anniversary of the battle about the 57th, or diehards. In the ordinary way, a man writes down something everybody already knows. Where it came from, nobody recorded at the time. What happened instead happened slowly. In 1829, 18 years after Albuera, an anonymous letter appeared in a service magazine signed "A Die Hard," and it told a story. Colonel Inglis, it said, had been struck down in front of his colors, had refused to be carried off, and had lain there calling on his regiment to die hard. It is a very good story. It is also the first time anyone had told it in print, and the writer put Inglis's wound in his breast, which is not where it was. In 1852, the Times ran an Albuera anniversary piece with a version of the same line: "Close your ranks, 57th. Die hard." and gave it to a Major General MacDonald, who had commanded Portuguese troops on a different part of the field and was not with the 57th at all. The historian Guy Dempsey went through all of it, including Inglis's own published account of the battle, and could not find a single document in which Inglis says the words, or in which he claims them. Inglis himself recovered. He went back to the Peninsula, made Major General, then Lieutenant General, became Governor of Cork and Colonel of his old regiment, and died in 1835. He is in Canterbury Cathedral. Dempsey's conclusion was that the regiment earned the name because its soldiers at Albuera died hard in fact, and not because their colonel told them to. There was a great deal of dying hard on that ground. Latham kept a flag and lost his face for it, and has a headstone in a French village where his brother officers put it. Out of all of it, the language kept one phrase. The phrase itself was already old. To die hard, to be slow and difficult about dying, was ordinary English before Albuera ever happened. What Albuera did was fasten it to a regiment. By 1844, die hard was being written down as a noun, in reference to the 57th Regiment of Foot, a thing a person could be rather than a thing a person did. That is the word we still use. It sits in the language attached to nothing anyone remembers, in the mouths of people who have never heard of Extremadura. It came off a hill where a regiment was found lying in its ranks with every wound in front. And the one account anybody actually wrote down at the time is still sitting in a newspaper from the 6th of June. A captain, so severely wounded that he ought to have quitted the field, asking to be carried to the head of his company and set down where his men could see him. His name was Ralph Fawcett. He was 23. He did not live, and he does not get the phrase.